Hello everyone. Today we will talk about research ethics. My name is Anderson and let's get started. First of all, I would like to talk about plagiarism. Plagiarism is when you steal someone's ideas and present those ideas as your own. Some examples of plagiarism are copy and paste, and this includes when you copy text from a translation website. So if you are typing in Japanese, use the translation software or website and then copy the results directly into your homework. That is considered plagiarism. Another thing that happens very often is when students change just a couple words. This is not the same as paraphrasing. Paraphrasing is a legit way to use someone else's words in your research and in your homework, but changing a couple words is not the same. So please take care. Another thing that I would like to talk today is about fabrication and falsification. What is it? Well, it is when we write up data without actually producing it through proper questionnaires or searching and checking for data. Some examples of falsification and fabrication are when we create fake answers. So let's suppose I have a questionnaire and I have to apply that questionnaire to 20 respondents. So it is much easier if I just randomly create those answers and write my report. This cannot be done. Another example is when we get some answers and replicate those answers multiple times. That also cannot be done. So please, if you are doing questionnaires, make sure to collect the data correctly. So let's start the real talk about principles of research ethics. Here is part one. Part one, I will list a couple of principles that everyone doing research should abide to. So here are the 5 basic principles of research ethics. Principle 1, minimizing the risk of harm. So we will talk about this in a minute. We need to make sure that people participating in our research cannot be harmed, or the harm is minimized. Principle 2, we have to obtain an informed consent. So people participating in the research has to be aware of the objectives, what we are doing, and some other things that we will talk in a minute. Principle 3, we have to protect anonymity and confidentiality of the data that we get. Principle 4, we have to avoid deceptive practices. We have to avoid deceiving people into participating or answering our questionnaires. And principle 5, we have to provide the right at any moment for the participants to withdraw their participation in our research. So let's take a look at the principles one by one. First of all, minimizing the risk of harm. Uh, in order to do that, there are some basic questions you need to ask yourself. Is there any chance for participants to be harmed? Is there any chance that someone will not be comfortable? So, specifically, when we deal with questionnaires, some of our questions might make people uncomfortable. When you think about the questions in your questionnaire, you should think about that possibility and try to come up with ways that would minimize the discomfort that people might feel when answering your questions. Also, if there is any chance that your questionnaire or your research in itself causes any harm to the people participating in it, then it's your duty to make sure to inform people of what risks they are exposed to. Once you figure out this part, then you can move to the next principle. So, what are some ways that people can get harmed? Well, there are different ways a participant can get harmed. We're not talking about physical harm only. There are psychologically harm, socially harm, invasion of privacy, depending on the questions that you are asking, and also the harm of identifiability, which means in a way or another, people might be identified, and that can cause some harm to them in a certain way. So, how can we minimize the risk? Well, one way, which is quite obvious, is to plan properly your research. Also, even though we are planning the research and we are thinking deeply about the questions that we are going to ask to our respondents, to our participants, it is very important that we obtain an informed consent. The informed consent is a document which delineates and explains the range, the scope of our project, and makes sure that the participant has all the information necessary, and also assures us as researchers that the person participating has authorized us to use their data. Another thing is we need to make sure that the data is kept confidential. Also, participants' anonymity should be kept at all times. One easy way to do this is just to number your participants. Another thing we have to take care is we cannot lie and hide information. Sometimes in very specific situations, hiding some information from the participants, hiding information needs to be done in order to get honest answers, but this time this will not be the case, so there will be no lie and no hiding of information. And lastly, we should make sure that participants are allowed to stop at any time. One way to do this, and actually this is one clause in the informed consent, it needs to be clear to all participants that if they feel at any time uncomfortable, they are allowed to stop. Principle 2. So how do we obtain an informed consent? The informed consent is a document, as I mentioned briefly before, that explains the research, explains the purpose of the research, why are we doing this. Also, it explains what will be asked from the participants. It will explain the methods used in this research. It will also explain how the data that we collect from the answers of the participants will be used. It also explains possible inconveniences and risks to the participants. It also explains how to get more information about the research. Many times, in real research projects, some people will or want to know where to get more information than what is in the informed consent. So there should be a telephone number, email address of the responsible person or the responsible institution for the research. Also, the informed consent explains, as I mentioned before, how to quit, how to stop from the project. The informed consent is a must in any research project that deals with human subjects. Principle 3, protecting anonymity and confidentiality. So, why is it important? Participants will not share personal information unless they are sure that the data will not leak. We have many instances, many news about data leak, and personal information leak can sometimes be harmful to people. So it is very important that you, as a researcher, you keep the information, you protect the information from leaking at all costs. Also, another point very important is to explain where the data will be stored. How long is that data going to be stored? And if someone somehow gets access to that data, can they identify the participants? An easy example would be if you interview 10 people, but from those 10 people you have only one male. Okay, so if in your data you are recording the gender as male, female, and someone gets the data and look at your sample, at your population that you used for the interviews, that someone outside from your research circle would be able to identify the male participant. This is a very simple example, but this shows how even if we do not have the name of the person written down, looking at parts of your research and putting those things together like a puzzle would allow someone to identify the participants in your survey, in your project. Principle 4, avoiding deceptive practice. So, as I mentioned before, sometimes of research require that the participants do not know certain information, and many times in very specific research this is done so participants will honestly answer questions that would be otherwise biased if they knew certain piece of information. So sometimes some examples of data that can be hidden from the participants are who is collecting the data and what is the purpose of the research. So a simple example to these two bullet points here. For example, if we are doing a research for the government and we know that most people in our city are not happy with the government, we would probably want to hide the information that the government is collecting the data so people would not be biased to say bad things about the government. Another example would be for example, to explain a certain research. For example, a certain research where we want to show that men talk too much. Well, we would interview men and try to count their words, but if we tell them that the purpose of the research is to show that they talk too much, probably those men being interviewed would not speak naturally or as much as they would if they do not know that piece of information. So, as you can see in the slide, this is allowed only if the knowledge of the true purpose affects the outcome, as I mentioned in the previous examples. Also, sometimes it is impractical to inform everyone about details of the research project. In those cases, somebody responsible for the research in your institution will judge and say that because of this particular reason you are allowed to hide or to not tell all the information to the participants. Finally, Principle 5 is providing the right to withdraw. Well, so participants should be allowed to stop their participation at any time without any consequences to themselves. So when you are giving participants the informed consent form, it's important that you explain how they can stop their participation. And if that happens, you also need to think about how it affects your research. Many times when people are doing research, if someone decides to stop in the middle of the research, that can invalidate the data that the researcher is collecting. So in order to avoid this, what can we do? A simple example is when a researcher starts his or her project and gets data from the participants throughout several days. Then, if we do not keep track of each participant's data during the days, one thing that might compromise our research is if one person decides that they do not want to participate anymore after 2 or 3 days. And that person, that participant withdrawing from your project, decides that they want all their data erased. So, as you can see, if the researcher does not keep the data together for each participant, it would be impossible to erase the previous data for that single person withdrawing from the research after 2 days. In this example, the conclusion, the final outcome would be that all data for the first 2 days would have to be erased, because it would be impossible for the researcher to identify a single person in the complete received data from the first 2 or 3 days. So before we save the data, before we record the data, it's very important to think about the consequences of some participants quitting the research in the middle of the way. Then finally we reach part 2 of our presentation, and this is regarding research. How do we do it? Well, the first thing you have to ask yourself is, are you dealing with human subjects? If you are, then everything we talked before up to this point is valid for you. You do have to think about data storage. You do have to think about the time you will keep that data, where you will keep that data, who you are going to ask, how you are going to ask, informed consent, etc., etc., etc. If you are not dealing with human subjects, so if you are not dealing with human subjects, then it means that you have not to worry about informed consent. For example, can we come up with some examples of research without dealing with human subjects? Yes, we could, for example, do research by observing some behavior or observing something that is happening. Let's see a clear example, an easy example to understand is, for example, when city officials hire people to be at crossroads to count the number of cars passing by. In this case, there is no informed consent. People will just go to the cross section of a road, and then they will be there counting the cars that go in one direction or another, and they will check the time, they will get the count of the cars, and they will take that data to their supervisors, and finally a decision will be made whenever they need a new traffic light or not. So if you are counting cars on public streets, then probably you don't need an informed consent form. But that's not to say that projects counting things do not need permission. Of course, every time you want to do research, you need to prepare, you need to think about the impact of your research. If you are going to a private parking lot and you are going to count cars or take pictures, there might be some other types of permission that you might have to get. Then here at the university, since your research is being done under an advisor or under a professor's inside the professor's class, it means that you need to get the professor approval. Do not start your research without your professor's approval. Okay, so if you do not submit your research for approval and you are in the middle of your research project will be cancelled. In our class, the research is approved by one of the teachers, and that's fine. And that's another reason why we ask students to keep their data sample, to keep their interviews within the classroom. This is done to avoid any outside problem. Okay, proper research needs to be done very carefully, and what you guys are going to do for the final project is just the tip of the iceberg. We do not have much time. We have less than a month to complete a full research project, and we want to give you a taste of what a proper research is like. So here are some references that I used to build up this presentation. Please feel free to visit the websites and get more information if you need to. Also, the internet is full of resources about research ethics. You are invited to think deeply about your research and make sure that you do not cause any trouble to you, to your professors, or to your respondents. Thank you very much.